About 3 years ago, I got it into my head that I wanted to read all of the literary classics. I guess at the time I didn't realize just how many literary classics there were. I remember seeing the movie The Count of Monte Cristo, and I thought, okay, I'd like to read the book, The Count of Monte Cristo. Well, what I didn't know when I got the book out of the library, that it was quite large, The Count of Monte Cristo. Any of you have read that? It was a really large work. The movie wasn't that long. It took me longer to read the book than the whole movie was. I remember in Germany we had a family working with us, the Walter family. They enjoyed reading all the time they were reading. Every time we went over their house, they're all reading novels or books or Christian works. They're just constantly reading. One day, I came out, and I don't remember, I think it was out of the church building or in my car. I can't remember exactly the setting, but I had a large novel with me. And the man, Brian Walter, looked at the book and said, "Boy, Mark, that's an awful big book." And I thought, well, I do read big books. I thought, well, I do read big books. Yeah, it was a big book. Another book that I read here recently, probably in the last couple of years, was Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. Remember, it starts like this. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. That's right, The Tale of Two Cities. And as I thought about that work, I began to realize in my study of Revelation chapter 17, in my understanding of the Bible, is that history really is a tale of two cities. The history of mankind over the millennia can be broken down into two spiritual cities. The first one is spiritual Jerusalem. It's the place where Abraham went to offer up Isaac his son on Mount Moriah, where later the temple was to be built. The place that God says, "I will place my name on this city," the spiritual Jerusalem. And the other spiritual city that has been in competition with the spiritual Jerusalem throughout history is the spiritual, immoral Babylon. She has taken many forms and popped up in many different locations over history, and yet it is a city that's spiritually immoral in competition with the spiritual Jerusalem that draws people to the living God. The spiritual immoral Babylon draws people away from God and places man in the center of that religion. It really is a tale of two cities. And this morning we're going to see the judgment upon the great whore. And I'm going to use that word often. I hope it doesn't offend you. My translation uses prostitute. Your translation may say whore, for she truly is a great whore. Open up your Bible to Revelation chapter 17, and we'll go through this. We will try to move through this as quickly as possible without outrunning you, and yet see if we can gain understanding from Revelation chapter 17, for the judgment of the great whore is seen right here. 17 is probably the hardest chapter in all of the Revelation to understand. It is so symbolic, it is so detailed, and things seem to overlap in Revelation chapter 17. It makes it difficult to understand. When we read 17 and then we read chapter 18, it appears that there are two Babylons. Well, maybe the easiest way to help us to understand is this. Chapter 17 we see as the spiritual system Babylon. It's the spiritual system that has reigned out of the city Babylon for millennia. And then chapter 18 could be seen as the political system, the economic system of Babylon. And yet, having said that, it's still not so black and white that you can just draw a line right there, because as you read 17 and 18, they seem to overlap each other. And so it's really difficult, but it's easy to understand spiritual Babylon, political Babylon in 18. It's difficult to place chapter 17 chronologically in the midst of the tribulation period. I'll say it now, then I'll explain later what I'm talking about. It seems to fit best in the first half of the tribulation period. In the first half of the tribulation period, prior to the midpoint of the tribulation period. I'll explain later why I think that is. Look at verse number 1 with me. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute, the great whore, who is seated on many waters. We don't know which one of the 7 angels. One of them, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 last bowls, came to John and said, "Come, I want to show you something." In Revelation chapter 17, it's the only chapter in the Revelation that the angel interprets for us what we're about to hear. And I'm happy for that. Because Mystery Babylon truly is a mystery. And it may even at the end of the sermon today remain a mystery for us. But we will do the best we can to unravel this mystery and see if we can get our head around it. John sees the sentence of the whore carried out here in Revelation chapter 17. The word whore is used in the Old Testament also to describe godless cities. For example, in Jerusalem, when they turned away from the living God and served idols, was called a whore. Tyre was called a whore. Nineveh was called a whore. So cities in the Old Testament had this designation of a whore. And we are told that she is seated on many waters, and we have that interpretation in verse 15, exactly what the many waters are. There are people and languages and nations. Look at verse number 2. With whom, that's the great prostitute, the great whore, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. In the Old Testament, prostitution frequently symbolizes spiritual adultery, moving away from God, religious apostasy. Having served the true and living God, they move away to idols that can't hear or see or speak or do anything. That's called prostitution in the Old Testament. Now, there is a physical prostitution. We know that. People exchanging sex for money. But as we go through chapter 17, that's what's being described here. Not the physical act of adultery, but the spiritual act of moving away from the true and living God and serving idols. So anything that's idol worship or anything that replaces God as the center of worship is spiritual adultery. And that's what's being talked about throughout the whole chapter of 17. Now, granted, having said that, we know that even in the religious system, the spiritual adultery of Babylon, physical adultery did play a role. For in many of the ancient temples in the old times, they had temple prostitutes. And the purpose of the temple prostitutes is people came, paid money, that means they offered an offering, went into the temple prostitute, and spent time with them. Men and women prostitutes. So the physical act of adultery, sexual immorality, was tied into the spiritual act of immorality and adultery. And we see that vast numbers have come under her influence, and they are reduced to a staggering wretchedness. They're walking around like a drunken person because they have so influenced the life. She has so influenced these people's lives that it has taken them to the point where they look like they're drunk, staggering around. Verse number 3. And he carried me away, that's the angel, and John is speaking, and he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. So John is transported into a wilderness area, a desolate place. We don't know exactly where that's located at. We don't know. All we know is it's a wilderness-like place. It's desolate, perhaps in the spiritual realm, for he's transported spiritually into this realm. And when he's in this realm, in this wilderness, he sees a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. Here's an artist's rendition of what that could possibly look like. There's a woman that's sitting on this scarlet beast right here in verse number 3. And this scarlet beast was full of blasphemous names. It had 7 heads and 10 horns. He sees this woman riding up there with a golden cup in her hand. This whorish system is a burden upon the beast, and the beast has to carry this, has to support this whore that's riding upon him. Yet the beast carries the woman because for a time the relationship between the woman and the beast is mutually beneficial. The beast is using the woman, whereas the woman who thinks she's riding upon the beast thinks she's governing him. That's not the case, and we're going to see that later. We are told that this beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, back in the Revelation chapter 12, verse 3, we read this. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. And on his head 7 diadems. So we see that here Satan in Revelation 12 is talked about as being one with 7 heads and 10 horns. But then when we move to chapter 13 of the Revelation, we see this. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. That's the Antichrist. So we see kind of a morphing together of Satan and the Antichrist, or you can say that the Antichrist's power comes from Satan, for the two are described as having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, no symbol in the Revelation is given more identifying marks than this woman, right here. She must be very important for us to understand. Look at verse number 4. The woman was arrayed in perfect purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. So we see here that the great whore has attained wealth and status. She has power. And she displays that by her fine attire that she puts on. She is important, not only in her own eyes, but in the eyes of the world at the same time. She holds this golden cup. And as you look at the golden cup, we all like gold. I mean, we perhaps have a wedding band that's in gold. Ladies like gold. And they like diamonds too. Amen. Plug for 14th of February. The cup was gold. It was beautiful. And if you were standing back looking at the woman riding on this beast, the beast is hideous. Of course, we understand that. But the woman is beautiful. She looks pretty. And she's holding this cup in her hand. And you look from the outside, the cup is gold. Oh, right, that looks nice. But as soon as you peek into that cup and look in there, and bubbling up is sexual immoralities, impurities, abominations. She looks good on the outside, but if you get inside, she is wicked to the core. Is the idea of this. Look at verse number 5. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. Now we are told that whores in the ancient world used to wear a name band on their head. I guess for the people, their Johns, to remember what their names were. I don't know. Even the worst of the kind of the whores would have their names tattooed on their heads. Now, the title mystery indicates that this is something deeper. Now, it's not Babylon by the Euphrates. It's something deeper than that. It's a mystery. It's something that is hidden that needs to be revealed to us. It is that which is spiritually identified with Babylon. In other words, we take our reference from Babylon, and the spiritual identification is seen here. That's why it's a mystery, with idolatry or spiritual idolatry. Now, Babylon in the past, we know, Babylon, the city, oppressed God's people and propagated a false religious system. We understand that. Now, the name, we are told here in my translation, says on her forehead was a name of mystery. Now, certainly it is a mystery, her name. The name is certainly a mystery, but it also could be part of the name herself. In other words, she could be a name, mystery, Babylon, the great, mother of prostitutes. And I think it would be best if you put it, grammar is hard to tell where it actually goes, but it probably fits within the name itself. The name is Mystery Babylon, the Great, mother of all whores, prostitutes, and of earth's abominations. She is the source. She is the archetype of all other spiritual adultery systems, spiritual systems that move away from worshiping God and worship man. She is the mother of all of those, the archetype, the source. And when we go back to the Old Testament, we can see that all false religions ultimately stem from Babel, or what is known as Babylon. If you look in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 10. Back to the beginning. Go back to the beginning in Genesis chapter 10. I want to show you something here. Why I can say all false religions stem from Babel or from Babylon here. Go back to Genesis chapter 10. And in Genesis chapter 10 we read this. Now remember, this is after the Noah's flood. After the flood has happened, Noah's come out of the ark, Noah's planted all of his stuff, and people began populating the earth at that time. And God had told Noah and his sons, you spread out over the face of the earth. That's my command to you. Populate, repopulate the earth. Spread out all over. That was God's word. Look at verse number 8 of Genesis chapter 10. Cush followed Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. That's Iraq today. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh. Here's a guy who built one of the two major cities of the ancient world, Babylon and Nineveh. And then Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and it goes on and on. The word Nimrod, the name Nimrod, actually means one who rebels. We are told that he was a mighty man. He began to become a mighty man. So what he has done is he has focused Earth's attention onto himself. All the inhabitants of Earth at that time were located in one spot. And he says, look to me, I will give you guidance as your leader, is the idea of what's going on here. It says he was a mighty hunter, and that's really tame. The Hebrew has the idea that he's a mighty hunter of men's souls before or against the Lord. His goal was to gather mankind to himself away from God and center on who he was and what man is instead of who God is and what he has done. That was Nimrod's plan. For Satan realized, I think empowering Nimrod, but Satan realized he tried prior to the flood to destroy mankind. It didn't happen. He tried to corrupt all of mankind. God saved righteous Noah and his family and then began repopulating the earth. So he didn't win prior to the flood. So Satan changes his strategy now to, if you can't beat him, join him. So that's what he does. Nimrod then builds this religious system that's in contrast to the altar that Noah built when he came out of the ark. Remember, Noah came out of the ark, built an altar, and on that altar he offered up a sacrifice, a blood sacrifice. See, Noah understood that the way to God was through a blood sacrifice of an innocent victim, a substitutionary sacrifice. Noah understood that. And Nimrod now wants to teach mankind a new and different way. Nimrod built a system on human genius. Come on, let's get together and build a tower all the way to heaven. Let's make a name for ourselves. We're really smart people. We can do it. He builds a system on human genius and human reason. He says we can reach God by our own efforts. And we can understand him through our own human reason. We do not need God to reveal himself to us. We can figure out God ourselves, is Nimrod's way of thinking. Well, Nimrod married a woman named Semiramis. Semiramis is an interesting character in ancient literature. Actually, the Sumerians, if you've ever heard that name, they get their name from her, the people group of the Sumerians. Now, it's claimed that she, Semiramis, had a miraculous conception by a sunbeam, and her son Tammuz was conceived. Now, I thought about that for a second. I guess if you're married to the mighty hunter before the Lord, who hunts men's souls and is the ultimate leader of all of mankind, and you come to him one day and say, I'm pregnant, and you know it's not his, you make up a story. Makes sense to me. The story goes, a sunbeam made her pregnant. It was a miraculous conception, and her son Tammuz was conceived. At his birth, she claims that Tammuz is the fulfillment of God's promise in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. From the woman's seed, the Messiah will come. She claims this is him, Tammuz. Tammuz is the Messiah. He's the one from Genesis 3:15, God's promised Messiah. Well, sadly, at a young age, Tammuz is gored by a wild boar and he dies. So there goes all the hope of the Messiah. Now, the story goes either way. It could either be 3 days or 40 days. The story goes both ways. But nevertheless, 3 or 40 days, Tammuz comes back to life. The story goes. He is resurrected. Now, you see the imagery here that's going on in this false system of religion? We see a Messiah who dies and is resurrected. We see a virgin birth. We see Satan imitating God's future plan on this earth. And the sign of the cross becomes associated with the first letter of his name, Tammuz, Tau. Now, Semiramis takes to herself the title of the Queen of Heaven. If you've ever read in the book of Jeremiah, 5 times that phrase is used, the Queen of Heaven. That's who they're talking about right here. She takes to her name this Queen of Heaven. And she begins by being the first high priestess of this new cult, the cult of Ishtar. It is the mother-child cult. The mother, Semiramis, the son, Tammuz, and establishes this system of religion with the mother and child involved in this. Believe it or not, this is where we get the first pictures of a mother with a halo on her head holding a child with a halo on its head. It didn't come from the Middle Ages. It didn't come from the 15th, 16th, 17th artists. It came from way back in Babel, from this mother-child cult of Ishtar. Now something happens very important in verse number 25. I hope you're still in Genesis. Look at verse number 25. Genesis 10. So we see this mighty man collecting in rebellion against God. Remember, God says to disperse them on the land. He collects them together. He's the mighty man hunting men's souls, pulling them away from God to himself. Collects them all together. And in Genesis chapter 10, verse 25, we read this. To Abram were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. You say, why is that important? It's important by this. This is about 100 years after the flood. About 100 years after the flood. For if you look at that map over on the wall, you can see how the continents appear, and they do fit together. There was truly a continental drift, but it happened at one point in time where God divided the land, we're told here in verse number 25, for in his days the earth was divided. So here we have a group of people understanding the mother-child cult of Ishtar, gathered together at one point. God then disperses the people in Genesis chapter 11, confuses the languages, sends them out. After he sends them out, he divides the land. As they go out, they carry with him this knowledge of this spiritual system, and we see it in cultures all over the world. They just have different names for them. This false religion of the mother and child cult was carried by people throughout our own known world. For it went from Babel to the Sumerians, from the Sumerians to the Phoenicians, where she is called in Phoenicia Astaroth or Astarta, and Tammuz was called Tammuz or Baal, from Baal worship. Remember Elijah contending with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel? That's where this whole thing came from. The Phoenicians called her Astaroth and Baal. From the Phoenicians, it went to the Egyptians, where she is called Isis, and the child is called Osiris or Horus. There are 2 different names for him. From Egypt to Greece, where she's called Aphrodite or Aphrodite, and the child is called Eros. From Greece to Rome, where she is called Venus, and the child is called Cupid, the one with a bow and arrow, after his father Nimrod. In India, she's called Isis, and I don't know the spelling of this, please forgive me if it's spelled incorrectly, and the child is called Ishwara. In the Far East, she's called Sebel, and the child is called Diois. So we see as the earth was divided, they took this false religion with them throughout the entire world, and it ended up in all these continents under different names, but the same spiritual system. In John's day, Rome was that imperial city that influenced the entire empire with this mystery religion. For in Rome, she's called Venus, and the child is called Cupid. This false religious system that replaces God for the center of worship and makes man the center. Look at verse number 6. She therefore is the mother of all whores. She's the mother of all false spiritual systems of this earth. And I saw the woman, drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. False religions have killed millions over the centuries, and the last one here, Antichrist, will be much deadlier. When I saw her, I marveled greatly, John tells us. Verse number 7. But the angel said to me, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. Wow! I'm glad right here that God inserts, I'm going to interpret this for you, the angel says. Because up to this point, I'm scratching my head saying, what? I'm glad the angel's going to jump. Aren't you glad the angel's now going to interpret this for us so we can understand? He's going to open it up to us so we'll be able to comprehend what's going on. This is what the angel says. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come. And when he does, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not and is an 8th, but belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. Thanks, angel. I think I'm more confused now than when he started. Well, let's see if we can kind of crack this a little bit and get in and unravel these knots that are right here and see if we can come to some understanding of what this angel is trying to tell us. It really still isn't clear. He seems to muddy it a little bit. What we need to go back to, first of all, verse number 7, as he marveled, and then the angel says in verse 8, the beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. Now, when we go back to the book of Daniel, and you'll see a slide up here. When you go back to the book of Daniel, the 4 beasts that Daniel describes in chapter 7 are all kingdoms. They're individual beasts, but each beast represents a kingdom. We had the kingdom of Babylon, we had the kingdom of the Medo-Persians, we had the kingdom of Greece, and the kingdom of Rome. That's the one that's in the sea, the one that's hideous looking there, is Rome. So each one of the beasts represented a kingdom. So that's helpful for us to try to understand. And we are told that behind this kingdom is the demonic activity, for he rises out of the bottomless pit. We are told in 11:7 that the one who kills the 2 prophets is also the beast that rises out of the bottomless pit. In Revelation 13, the beast is a person, not just a kingdom, he's a person, the Antichrist. Here the representations are of kingdoms, yet in chapter 13 of the Revelation, we are told the beast is a person, the Antichrist. So when we talk about the beast, we talk about a king and a kingdom. And sometimes they're synonymous. Sometimes they overlap. So when we talk about the beast, it's talking about his kingdom. When we talk about the beast, it's talking about the king of that kingdom. They overlap, and that's why sometimes it's difficult to understand. In Daniel chapter 2, you'll see a graphic coming up here. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And in his dream, God revealed to him the future of the world history, basically. And he said there will be 4 major world empires before the rock that's cut out of the side of the mountain without human hands comes and crushes the statue and sets up his kingdom forever and ever. That's the Messiah. So there will be 4 world kingdoms till the Messiah comes. The first is the head, that's Babylon. Second is the Medes and the Persians in the arms and the chest. In the loin area is the Greece. And the legs represent Rome. Rome was divided east and west, or was represented east and west. It was made out of iron. And you'll notice it moves down into the toes, the feet area, and you see it looks a little bit different. Doesn't quite look just like iron. That's because when you get to the feet, it's clay mixed with iron. So the strength of iron is reduced because of the brittleness of the clay. That kingdom, the kingdom of Rome at that time in history, will not be as strong as it was in the past. So we see this statue that tells us of the 4 world empires that are going to come prior to the Messiah. And the last empire kingdom is Rome. And Rome ceased to exist as a kingdom, as an empire in 476 AD. It was, but it is not, and it is to come. The influence of this last kingdom is certainly demonic. Its power ascends out of the abyss. But the Roman Empire never really died. It still exists today in multiple forms around the world. It's still there. That's why Bible scholars say Roman Empire will be revived again in some form or another. Some say perhaps out of the European economic community, the Roman Empire that it'll be weaker than it was at one time, but nevertheless, it never truly died. It still exists. And now it will revive itself again as this world empire in the last days. It appeared dead, but it really isn't. What I found fascinating in my study is this. The European Economic Community has a parliament building in Brussels. And in the parliament building, that's where all the representatives of all the nations who belong to the European Economic Community, they come and they meet and they make decisions for the entire United States of Europe, if you want to say that. Inside the Parliament building, they have selected a painting from a 16th century Italian artist named Paleo Veronese as a representation of what the European Economic Community is. What is the representation? Inside the Parliament building is a large portrait done by this man, this 1580 Italian artist, and on the portrait is this: a woman riding on a beast atop 7 hills. Now the beast is not like you saw in that one picture, the dragon-looking beast, but it is an ox or an oxen. And it comes from a mythological story where the Greek god Zeus falls in love with the legendary beauty of Europa. He comes down and he makes himself into an ox. He changes himself into a handsome bull, and he carries her off to the island of Crete where she bears him 3 sons. And the title of this painting is called The Rape of Europa. Why would they choose that painting to represent them? Another thing we need to look at is this idea of someone that was and is not and is to come. It could also be a reference to the mortal wound that the Antichrist received. Remember, he received a mortal wound, appeared to be dead, and then was resurrected. Revelation chapter 13, verse 3. Could be that. All I know is when we get down to verse number 9, this is what I need. This calls for a mind with wisdom. That's what I need. I need wisdom. We need supernatural enlightenment from God to understand this. He goes on in verse number 9. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Now, Rome in the west, the Roman city that John knew in his day, was a city that rested on 7 mountains, 7 hills. People understood that. They knew it was a common phrase. Look at this coin that was found during the time of Vespasian. I think it was right around 71 AD. The front side of the coin is on the left hand. That's where his face is at. And there are a bunch of Roman letters, and they all represent something. The other on the right-hand side is the back of the coin. On the front of the coin, it says this: Emperor Caesar Vespasia Augustus, Pontifex Maximus, which means greatest priest, the head of the college of pontifices. Tribunica Protesa, tribal power, Pater Patria, father of the fatherland, council for the 3rd time. That's him. Talk about self-glorification, huh? Okay. On the back side of the coin, you see that right there. On the back of the coin is the goddess Roma. It's the ancient name of the city Rome. In military dress, sitting on Rome's 7 hills. You can count them if you can count those little hills right there. She's sitting on the 7 hills. At her feet is Poseidon, representing the river god in Tiber, the river Tiber. To her bottom left is, you can barely see it, is Romulus and Remus sucking on a wolf's, drinking from a wolf. That was the legends, Romulus and Remus. Yes, thank you for all those who understand what I'm talking about. So they're drinking from this wolf. That's Romulus and Remus. So you see, even in his day, Rome was understood to be a city that sits on 7 hills. That's Rome, that's the western part of the Roman Empire. In the eastern part of the Roman Empire, we have a city called Constantinople. It used to be Byzantium. And the Emperor Constantine took that city as his second capital and was going to make it his primary capital. That city is Constantinople. It's known today as Istanbul. It is also a city that sits on 7 hills. Now it gets a little more confusing. Not only are they 7 mountains on which the woman is seated, verse 10, they are also 7 kings. 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come, and when he does come, he must remain only a little while. So it gets even more confusing. Not only are they 7 hills, they're 7 kings. And there's no way that we can reconcile the emperors of Rome and say there's 7 of them. There's just no way. There are too many of them. No matter how you try to massage the emperors and say, oh, there are good emperors and bad emperors, you can't get a number 7. You just can't do it. So it can't be the Roman emperors. It could very well represent kingdoms, remember? Kings equals kingdoms. It could represent the 7 world kingdoms that persecuted the people of God. For example, throughout history, Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, Medo-Persia, Greek. 5 were, but they're dead. One is, that's Rome in John's day. Rome is alive and well. And one is to come. That's the Antichrist, the revived Roman Empire. That's yet to come. And his kingdom will only last for a short period of time. Verses 12 and 13. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour, together with the beast. These are of one mind and hand over their power and authority to the beast. So here we see 10 kings who have no kingdom. So they have some sort of power. I'm guessing probably monetary power, financial power. Now it's been told, and I don't know, I don't have the list right here, I could get it for you if you want to know, that the people who are the movers and shakers in this world have divided up the entire world into 10 regions. Maybe these 10 regions are ruled by some financial person that's very rich, and he then gives his power to the beast for a short period of time. Verse 14. They will make war on the beast. They have one mind. They give all their power to the beast. And the beast thinks, okay, I can do anything. Verse 14. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. So we see that they make war on the Lamb, but they can't overcome the divine warrior. There's no way. He's too powerful. He's too mighty. He's the King of kings and Lord of lords. And the ones that come with the Lamb to fight with him are not angels. They are called, chosen, and faithful. There's a designation of Christians. They come with him to fight against the Antichrist in that battle that we have called the War of Armageddon. Verse 15. And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated. Remember we said the angel would tell us, this is clear. There are peoples and multitudes and nations, and she reigned over the whole world, this false spiritual system. Now verse 16 and 17. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. Remember, they rode on her for a period of time. It was mutually beneficial that they let her ride there on their back. But there will come a time where they will say, she is no longer needed, this false spiritual system. They hate her. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. That's why I think this takes place in the middle of the tribulation period, and here's my reasoning for it. In the middle of the tribulation period, the Antichrist stands up, or actually he sits in the temple of God, and he says, I am God, worship me. You can find that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He breaks his covenant with the nation of Israel, and he declares himself God. In this false religious system, there are many gods. They take many different forms. And the beast tolerates those different forms for a period of time. And then when he sits in the temple and declares himself God to be worshipped as God, they no longer can compete with him, for he is the emperor of the entire world. He cuts them off. That's the middle of the tribulation period. That's why I think it fits well right there. It is no longer about the collective human genius or the collective human reason. It's about the Antichrist and him alone. It's all about him. We're told it's from God. God's moving this. God is using the wickedness and the self-exaltation of the Antichrist to fulfill his plan. God always keeps his promises. Look at verse 18. And the woman that you saw is a great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. Now John certainly understood Rome to be that great city of his day. Rome was the center of this false religious system. All roads lead to Rome, and all false idol worship leads out of Rome to the entire empire. But this mystery Babylon, she has been many cities in human history. In the future, it may very well be Babylon by the Euphrates. It may be that city. Or it may be Rome. Or it may be some city of the European Economic Community. I don't know. But over history, she has taken different forms in different cities, but she has always been there. Wherever she is located, she will be the center of false spiritual system that elevates human effort over the grace of God and reason over the revelation of God. Here's some things for us to remember. At this point, let me have the worship team come up right now. Some things that we need to remember from this mystery that has been revealed to us. Hopefully it's a little clearer now than it was. Still, some things we may have to wait till we get into the presence of God to understand fully. But things that we need to remember as we read Revelation chapter 17 and Revelation chapter 18. The first one is this. Mystery Babylon exists today. She is alive and well. I don't know where she's located in one particular city of the world. I don't know. But she is spread out all over the world. She is alive today. In fact, in Revelation 18 verse 4, John tells us this. Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people. God's talking. Come out of her, my people. Don't be involved with this religious spiritual system that has not me in the center, but man in the center. Lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. Come out. She exists today. She exerts influence through media, through television, through radio, through books. She exerts her influence all over in our society today. She is alive. Secondly is this. Mystery Babylon is anything that replaces God as the center of worship. if it becomes angels as the center of worship, or if it becomes the galaxy as the center of worship, or science as the center of worship, whatever replaces God as the center of worship is Mystery Babylon. And she's living today. Mystery Babylon is a merit-based salvation, human effort. I can earn God's pleasure by what I do, versus a grace-based salvation, that the work is finished by Jesus Christ on the cross. Mystery Babylon says you earn it, God will give it to you. The Bible says Jesus earned it, and by faith it can be yours when you believe. Mystery Babylon says it's more important what you do than who you are. It puts the emphasis on performance. You do this and this and this, and you've got to be a good Christian. You do this and this and this, and God has to be pleased with you. It puts the emphasis on doing and not on being. Your character, your godly character, the fruit of the Spirit that pours out of you. The emphasis is on performance and not who you are in Christ. Mystery Babylon focuses on man's reason and ignores God's revelation. And the last one is the most important for us today. It's this. Mystery Babylon is in the church. She's here. It's anything that centers on the Christian and not on the Christ. I don't know how many songs I hear on Christian radio today, and I'm all for contemporary worship music, don't get me wrong. But the music and the songs revolve around the Christian and not around the Christ. Teaching today is focusing on the Christian and not on the Christ, what He's done for the Christian. I'm not against how-to sermons. We need to understand those things. But when it's all about me in the sermon and not about Jesus, there's something wrong. Or what about worship? Oh, did you have a good worship service today? Oh, yeah, I was really moved by the music. Well, that's not what I asked you. Did you worship God today at church? Oh, yeah, the music really moved me. Or some self-help groups that are popping up all over in the church today. See, Mystery Babylon is all about me, me, me. And it's not about Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And she is alive in the church today. Paul's desire for the church at Corinth is that we would have a sincere and simple devotion to Jesus Christ. That we wouldn't get wrapped up in all these things that focus on the human being to the exclusion of the creator of the universe, God. And I fear some of us have fallen prey to Mystery Babylon when it's all about me and my life revolves around me and not about Jesus Christ. Let's pray together. Father, we see this evil influence that started back millennia ago. Started through a person that drew attention to themselves, and from that began a religious system that focuses all on man. Man's reason, man's effort, and forgets the Creator God, and forgets the one who died on the cross for our salvation, and centers on me, me, me. And Father, we have fallen prey to that. We are interested in pop psychology and not in your revealed word. We're interested in men and women's ideas and thoughts more than we're interested in your word. We have fallen prey to Mystery Babylon in the church. God, I ask that you would cleanse our hearts, that you would draw us back to you, to being the center of our worship, and that everything we do is about you.